It all started on one ordinary day at the corporate headquarters in Seoul. The man in the office, to the ticking of the wall clock, was scrutinizing the employee card of Jean Hesop, who was an S-class tour guide. After reviewing the information properly, the white-haired man looked up at the candidate and asked if he really wanted to apply to join their guild. Noting to himself that this is a very important interview that he does not want to fail, Jean replies that it is indeed his wish. The man at the table was a bit amazed, and so asked if Jin knew that they didn't have any guides above C-class at the moment. Jin smiled and asked back, asking how long they would ask him the same thing. It was enough to silence his employer for a while. Still, a few moments later, the blonde looked up at Jin again and said that he could hardly take his word for it and was used to checking things out. The blonde man, whose name was Andante, was the leader of the Noabi C-class guild. He couldn't understand why Jin, with his class, had chosen them. After all, with a rank like that, Jin would be gladly taken by any other guild. Andante's question was not a surprise to the boy. He had expected it. Jin remarks that this is quite logical and can be compared to if he had gotten the highest score in the university entrance exams and suddenly decided not to enroll. In the end, the guy decides to tell Andante that he has one condition. The guild leader replied that he was listening attentively. Then Jin declares his desire to limit himself to touching only when providing support. Andante chuckled. The man said he understood the boy's request very well. He thought to himself that having a confirmed S-class didn't mean that the support he received would match it. But still, Andante found Jin's explanation insufficient and asked him again why he had chosen the Noabi Guild. Noabi stressed that their guild is not doing anything special right now, and there are many other more promising organizations. To back up his words, he mentioned that their latest endeavor at the moment was finding a cat. This news almost made Jin cringe. The guild leader then told him that since they were in the guild doing all sorts of tasks, but not too difficult, Jin would probably just have nothing to do here. Guy parried that despite this, the guild is still looking for a guide. Andante said that even if the power is used in everyday life, negative energy builds up in one way or another. Jin then said that in this case, his support would definitely be enough. Andante looks up and says he's right, mockingly adding that Jin is an S-class guide. Jin lowers his head. Andante's tone confused him, and the guy thinks that his words didn't convince the guild leader. The blonde then says that paying the money will also be a problem, as it is unlikely that they will be able to pay Jin a salary commensurate with his rank, as their employment is quite variable. To this, he gets the answer that Jin is fine with it. Andante says that even so, the guy must expect to get a certain amount of money for his work. He asks Jin not to be shy and just say the amount. The guy backs up a bit, gathering his thoughts. Then he finally makes up his mind and names the amount. 310. This is the amount he needs to pay all his expenses and live comfortably. But having said that, Jin then immediately starts to doubt what he said, thinking he's asking too much for his services. In the end, he feels uncomfortable that he's asking for that kind of money just for a touch, a kiss at most. And that's it. Andante smiled. He says the guy is asking for a perfectly reasonable amount and that's fine, telling the guy he can take the job from tomorrow. The boy blushed with embarrassment, surprised by the news. Meanwhile, Andante was watching Jin's reaction carefully, and he found it strange that a guide of such a high rank was so happy to join a C-class guild. After that, Andante offers the boy to sign the contract right away, without putting it off until tomorrow, and promises to introduce Jin to the rest of the espers tomorrow. The boy bows and thanks Andante. The guild head then asks if the guy has decided on a support partner. Jin is only surprised to hear the guild leader ask about a partner. A support partner is an esper who protects the guide. It is known that guides often choose an esper for protection. Jin says that right now he is still not sure who he should choose for support. In fact, he didn't know there was such a practice. Then Andante, rummaging through his desk and pulling out a stack of papers, tells him that he can choose anyone he wants. Rustling papers, the guild leader says that their espers have no guides or bets if Jint any of them. They will all be very happy with his choice. In fact, Jean isn't sure if he even needs an esper for protection if Andante was talking about them doing cat finding. After these words, Andante abruptly stops rustling papers and stops talking without looking at the guy. Then he raises his eyes to the boy and asks him in surprise if he is sure. Jin confirms his previous words and notes that Andante's face changed dramatically after his words. Andante looks at the boy with a hard stare, wondering if Jin is sure he can do without defenders. Jin notices that the general atmosphere in the room has changed abruptly. Now the guy starts to think that he should have chosen someone. But then Andante starts laughing and says that it is a new thing when a guy doesn't need protection. The guild leader says the guy has a trite mindset. But when Jin asks him what he meant, Andante changes the subject and says that if Jin doesn't need help, there's no problem. Since Jin has now been hired, Andante introduces himself to him once more and expresses his hope that they will work together. Not fully understanding what is so wrong with his teammate, Jin also says that he hopes for a fruitful collaboration. The guy would be happy to ask Andante again for support, but realizes that the leader will probably just pretend he didn't hear. In the end, the guy decides to leave it at that and find the positive in the fact that it worked out and he was hired by the guild, and that's enough for now. The next day, Andante gathers all the employees and brings a new employee to the meeting, S-Class Guide Jean. The boss says that from now on, the guy will be working with them, so they should be nice to the newcomer. Jean bows to his colleagues and asks them to take care of themselves. One of the workers, with red hair, immediately jumps up from his seat and moves closer to the guy, not believing his eyes. His face was clearly delighted to have an S-Class guide on their team. He says it's a pleasure to meet the guy and says his name is Cherney. Cherney is a C-Class Esper. Jean says it's nice to meet him too, but asks the guy to move a little farther away. As if ignoring Jin's words, Cherney asks if he can call the guy Hen. Realizing that the red-haired guy won't budge, Jean says he can call him whatever he sees fit. Then Cherney, out of joy, asks Jean to repeat again that he's an S-Class guide, to which the guy says he can even show the ranking chart. Then Cherney says that he was very surprised, as the manager had not looked for anyone for the position of guide for more than 2 years, when suddenly now there was a suitable candidate. But the most surprising thing was that an S-Class person was hired for the position. With his usual curiosity, Cherney asks the boss how he managed to accept such a person into their team, adding that the candidate's level is clearly higher than that of the other employees. Smiling, the supervisor says he had no reason to turn Jean down, considering the guy was so insistent about hiring him. Cherney was a little taken aback by the news. He thought that it was the boss who had found such a valuable employee. But after learning that Jin himself had asked to hire him, the red-haired guy rushed to ask Jin why he had decided to work in such a cloaca as their guild. One of the co-workers asked Cherney to stop, but he had already gone wild. His brain was thinking fast, and then, in Cherney's mind, a suggestion was born. The red-haired boy looked intently into Jin's eyes and asked if Jin was a spy, because the whole situation looked rather suspicious. Cherney's question was heard by everyone present, so the leader reasonably asked Cherney what he thought a spy would need in a guild like this one. Cherney was embarrassed and admitted that if Jin wasn't a spy, then he didn't understand why the guy had come to work here in the first place. The newcomer pretends that he doesn't understand Cherney's words either. He says that he has favorable conditions here. He will give support only through touch. The red-haired guy smiled, his figure looming over Jean. Looking the guy in the eye, he asked him if this meant that Jean wasn't going to go any farther than kissing in his work. But even if it did, the guy asked Jean what the reason for this decision was, emphasizing that most guides were happy to go for more intimate contact. Andante interrupted the guy and asked him not to ask dumb questions on his first day of work. Cherney says he sees nothing wrong with such questions and insists that all the guys are thinking the same thing, to which Andante replies that only Cherney is thinking the same thing. But the red-haired guy won't let up as he continues to question Jean about his decision. He says it's still strange, considering that he won't have much of a future here. Jin says that there is no reason why he chose this particular guild, adding that he doesn't like putting his life in danger at all and would feel comfortable and safe here. Andante laughed, and the rest of the guild members looked at Jin in bewilderment, as if he had just said something nonsensical. The leader steps closer, placing a hand on Hessup's shoulder. He says that if that's the main reason, then the boy has hit the mark, for their guild is definitely the safest of all. Looking into the eyes of his new employee, Andante smiles and says that he guarantees it. The story goes on to explain that espers are creatures with unique abilities, depending on which they are divided into classes, S, A, B, C, D, F, and guilds in turn unite espers and use them to clear dungeons. As it follows from the story, guilds are divided into 4 classes: S, A, B, C, S. Guilds are the fewest because there are few S espers with unique abilities. As for the C-class guilds, judging by what was said, they work strictly within a certain area, and since there are quite a few of them, the tasks and activities of each of them are significantly different. Some worked with low-level dungeons, but as Jin realized, the Noabi was not one of them. On the contrary, they operated outside the rifts and were considered the worst of the worst. The lack of work was weighing on Jin, who now finally understood Andante's words that this guild was the safest of all. The boy said that some of the espers had gone abroad, and those who remained had been idle all week. The boss was looking at the monitor with a smart look, as if he was doing something important. But Jin soon realized that the boss wasn't doing anything either, and was just playing games on his computer. Thinking about it, Jin realizes why the guild hasn't hired a guide for 2 years. They simply had no place for negative energy to accumulate, because the espers were doing nothing all day long. At this rate, there is really no point in hiring and paying a guide, and realizing this, Jin notes that it can't go on like this. The guy realizes with horror that if his services are not needed for the next month, he can easily be fired. This does not suit him, so he decides to do something useful, like cleaning. Jean puts on a mask and picks up a broom. Cherney watches the newcomer poking around with interest and asks Jean what he's doing. Jean replies that he's busy cleaning and Cherney assumes the guy has asthma, but Jean says he's not sick. Realizing that Jean is cleaning out of boredom, a colleague suggests that the two of them go out on a date to a cafe or restaurant, telling him that he is a master at it. Jean refuses, citing that he's at work, and Cherney's entreaties that they don't do anything here anyway don't work. Suddenly, the guy is interrupted by Andante, who tells him to finish cleaning up. Getting up from his chair, the boss says that they just got a job and asks Jin if he wants to join him. Glowing with happiness, Jin pulls back his mask and says that he would love to join Andante in the work. The supervisor asks him to gather the necessary things and move out. Jin was very happy as he finally had some work to do. Before leaving, Andante tells Cherney that he also has a job to do. He has to go looking for the cat they recently found, because it is missing again. The red-haired boy was not very happy about this news, emphasizing that they had already found this cat. Andante says that all this is true, but as it turns out, there was a hole in the fence through which the cat managed to escape again. The boss shrugs his hands, saying that it's all the fault of the cat's careless owner, but these words are of little comfort to Cherney. Not only does he have a job to do that he's already done before, but on top of that, he's allergic to cats. The supervisor says he understands, but the job must be done, so he suggests the guy take his medicine and move out. Cherney was depressed and pissed off, so as soon as the team left, the guy cursed loudly. Jean, on his way to the place of work, was ready for everything: scary monsters, dark dungeons, and even the end of the world. However, the reality, as usual, turned out to be more prosaic. The guild's place of work was a kindergarten, which gave Jin a slight shock. The place was very noisy, and the guy had to be very careful that some kid running around the room didn't hit him. But even that wasn't the worst part of the whole situation. What embarrassed Jean the most was the stupid thing he had to do. On camera, the guy had to shake rattles, making a funny ringing sound. At one of these moments, the guy was quietly approached by a petite girl who began to look at him with interest. On camera, Jean handed her a lollipop, which the girl happily took. Andante was the operator of the children's party. He asked the teacher if they had filmed enough, and the woman, with admiration in her voice, replied that they had done a great job, thanking the team for their good work. At the end of the shoot, Andante thanked Jean for a great job, but the guy's response wasn't so confident. The supervisor joked with Jin, pointing out that he must have overstretched his arm while shaking the rattles. The guy was annoyed. He noted that Andante didn't have an ounce of shame or sympathy. The guy then bowed politely to the caretaker, while the boss talked to the woman. He told her that if everything suited her, she would receive the pictures in the mail the next day. The woman replied that everything was fine with her and invited them to dinner together. Andante said he was grateful for the opportunity, but he had plans for the evening, along with Jean, so he declined. Then the boss took the boy by the arm and dragged him outside. On the street, Andante said that it was quite late and that it would be nice to have dinner somewhere. He asked the boy what he liked to eat, to which Jin replied that it would be nice to have dinner at home. Then the supervisor asked Jin if it was because someone was waiting for him at home. The boy replied that no one was waiting for him because he lived alone. Andante smiled and said that in that case, there was no need for this wall between them. To be honest, these words discouraged Jin. He didn't fully understand their meaning. The leader explained that he hadn't eaten dinner with anyone for a long time, and now eating alone was making him sad. Jin tried to cheer up the boss by pointing out that it wasn't all bad, since Andante had an entire guild. He replied that his underlings didn't want to spend much time with him because he was their leader. He then wept defiantly about having to choke on food alone in his house every day, pointing out that eating alone can cause depression. Andante then began to pity him by saying that he was a stranger and that he did not get along well with people. After much drama, Andante calmed down and apologized with a cheerful look, saying that a boss he'd known for a week shouldn't be so insistent on having dinner with him. Jin said he wasn't embarrassed at all, and then agreed to have dinner with his boss. Andante's face lit up with a bright smile when he heard the words. Jin repeated that he wouldn't mind having dinner with Andante, and then the man asked if Jin would mind having it at his house. This was a turn of events Jin could not have expected. On the way to the apartment, Jin couldn't help thinking that something was wrong. The situation when he had agreed to have dinner with his supervisor and then they went to his apartment seemed strange to him. Jin had only slightly opened the door, but Andante, immediately after hearing the creak of the door opening, turned the lad around to face him and leaned toward him, causing Hesop to have a fit of surprise. Jin turned back around and took off his jacket, inviting Andait to come inside. Before doing so, the guy told him that the apartments were quite modest, to which the boss said that they really weren't S-class. Jin asked why these two facts should be connected, to which he was told by his manager that it was quite normal, and that if he was S-class, he could afford to live in a hotel as if he were in his own home. Jin asked if this would apply to those who could not provide full support and therefore had to live in fairly simple conditions. Meanwhile, Andante began to walk around the apartment, taking a closer look at Jin's living conditions. He noticed that everything was designed for one person, even the dining table. Andante realized that either the guy had not thought about possible guests, or he had not even intended to invite anyone to the house. He turns to Hesop and asks him if it is true that he moved here recently. The question surprised the boy, and he asks how Andante came to that conclusion. The leader says that it's obvious to the naked eye, although all the necessary things here are new. Andante also suggests that he is the first guest in the house, and Jin, with embarrassment, confirms his words. The guy then starts rummaging around in the kitchen and warns his guest that he's not that good at gourmet food. But Andante reassures him and tells him that he's not hungry and won't be having dinner. The supervisor leans over the table and says that the guy only has one chair at home anyway, and it won't be conducive to eating dinner together, so Jin should eat alone. This really surprised Jin as the owner of the house, but Andante told him that he could easily go without food for a few days. Then Andante says that it's time to go home, which completely shocks the boy. Jin becomes very embarrassed and does not understand why Andante so abruptly changed his mind about dinner and why he came at all. In the end, he comes to the conclusion that the manager was just interested to look at the conditions and the apartment of the new employee. The boy asked the man if it was true, and Andante turned to him and smilingly said it was true and praised Jin for his intelligence. The guy said that if the manager was interested in just looking at the apartment, he could have said so directly, for Jin would not have refused him. Then the leader smiled, saying that it was unlikely to be true. He loomed over the boy, looking down at him and saying that it couldn't be that simple. Jin asked Andante why he thought it couldn't be as simple as he said. The supervisor says that it is unlikely that a person would agree to let a stranger into his apartment who is interested in how a person lives. Hesop parries that Andante is his supervisor, not a stranger. The man smiles and says that's nice to hear, but it's unlikely that a man he's only worked with for a week stops being a stranger. He reminds Jin that he is an Esper, and despite the fact that guides are very valuable, it is not a good idea to let your guard down. Andante starts touching Jin's chin, saying things like, for example, if he were an Esper who had lost control and lost any moral values, No one knows what he might be doing to Jin right now. Jin swallowed nervously, not answering. Andante smiled. He continued, saying that a situation like this doesn't resolve easily, especially since Jin has no support at all. And especially since Jin is an advocate of incomplete support, he should be doubly careful. Fighting nerves and embarrassment, Jin replies that he will be careful from now on. Andante smiles and leaves. Before saying goodbye, he says that he will see Jin tomorrow at work, then locks the door. Left alone in his apartment, Jin nearly falls to the floor. He walks staggering through the house and notes that he has been feeling fine for a long time, but now the stupor has come over him again after Andante came to his house. After that, Jin was haunted all night by intrusive thoughts, apparently reminding him of the past. His face was flushed and his whole body ached, and he noted wistfully that nothing had changed. The next day, Jin went to work early. His supervisor greeted him with a friendly smile, but Cherney didn't seem to be in the best shape after his search for the cat. Jin asked his colleague how he was feeling. Cherney was so exhausted that he barely lifted his head and said that he was in a very bad way. Jin thought about it, deciding that the search for the cat only seemed so easy at first glance, but judging by Cherney's behavior, it was a very difficult task. Seeing Cherney's predicament, Jin offers his services to support him. Cherney shudders and agitatedly accepts the help of the guild's new guide. Andante cuts him off abruptly, however, saying that he doesn't need any support, reminding Cherney with a smile that he's just found a cat, and he should just get some sleep instead of bothering his guide for nothing. The boss casually demonstrates that he forgot to add Cherney's work and tells him that he still has to go to the post office to pick up the package, and only then can he rest. Andante also adds that it should be done quickly. Cherney reluctantly gets up and puts on his jacket. As he walks to the door, he loudly expresses his displeasure, remembering that he does all the dirty work all the time, and when Cherney leaves, he loudly slams the door, saying that sooner or later he will quit this place. It was hard for Jin to see the way the chief treated Cherney. He asked Andante why he did that to the boy, for he was their guide now and could help them if the Esper had spent a lot of effort. Andante smiles and replies that Jin is right, and he hired him to help restore the Espers, but adds that the accumulation of small doses of negative energy is also good for them, and if you get used to small amounts, you can work and live in peace. The boy replies that the guild must have gotten used to this a long time ago. Andante looks at the boy with interest and asks him if Jin can't wait to help someone. Jin is nervous and says he doesn't understand why. Now that Andante has hired a new guide, he should send the Espers to sleep instead of letting Jin help them, because if this keeps up, there won't be any work for him at all. The boss smiles and says that the guy should not worry so much, because there will always be a job for him, and he will get tired of it. The boss's words surprised the boy, but Andante then immediately offered Jin lunch. Jin agrees. Then the boss asks him what he is having for lunch today. Jin replies that he will have rice balls and sausage for lunch, asking if Andante will have some. The boss spreads his hands, wondering if the guy will always ask this question, and says his answer hasn't changed from yesterday. Jin says it would be okay. It's just that Andante is looking at him really weird, so he thought the boss was hungry too, but the boss tells Jin to just ignore him. Then Jin takes his lunch. All the while the boy chewed his rice balls, Andante watched him carefully, as if looking for something in Jin's behavior. A few minutes later, Andante broke the silence by pointing out that Jin had a rather small mouth. The boy didn't immediately understand why his boss would bring it up, but then he agreed that he did, and that he did have a small mouth. Andante cheered up and suggested that something must be hard to fit in his mouth, pausing mysteriously. Jin asked what the boss meant by saying it could hardly fit in his mouth. Andante laughed and said he was talking about sausages. Jin said that if they were as big as that, he could eat them, which made the boss laugh even more. Andante then tells the guy that there's a guild meeting tomorrow, by government decree, and they need to attend. The boss assumes it's because of the dungeons, as small and large rifts have recently opened up in Korea at the same time. He also said that the big gates had become quite numerous, so the government was planning to distribute all the guilds in advance so as not to concentrate all the forces on just one area. He also adds that he has no desire to go to this meeting, but since it is mandatory, he has no choice. This is because as soon as Andante shows up at the meetings, the other guild leaders start criticizing him. That was an interesting observation, so Jin asked the boss to tell him more about it. Andante said that their guild hadn't visited a single dungeon in 2 years, and apparently that would piss everyone else off. Jin then wonders if Andante is planning to go on a sweep this time. The boss leans in close to Jin and says that if he does, Jin will have to leave. His words were a big surprise to the guy. He didn't even know how to react. All he could manage was to ask why Andante felt that way. The boss says that the main reason Jin joined them is that they are the safest guild, and they don't go to the rifts. He said that although he hadn't thought about it before, it was unlikely that he would leave the guild because they would have to go into the dungeon. This clearly cheered Andante up. Meanwhile, he began to think that it was inevitable that espers would have to go to the dungeons because it helped keep the guild afloat financially. However, he wondered how Noabi had managed to stay afloat for 2 years without entering the dungeons. Seeing Jin's sudden embarrassment, Andante tells him not to worry, because if everything works out, the guy won't even have to go to the rift. This really surprises Jin, as he didn't think it was possible. The boss says it's not a problem. They'll just have to listen to a few swear words for themselves. Andante finally gets up from his chair and says they'll make it work, before leaving, asking the guy to remember that the meeting starts tomorrow at 2 o'clock. But Jin has nothing to worry about, since his boss says he'll pick him up as soon as he finishes some important business before then. As promised, the next day Andante appeared in front of Jin's house at the appointed time, with his solid black car and the latest model of telephone, and his suit was as if it had just come from the hand of a master. Jin stopped short of the car. Looking at the way Andante was dressed, he wondered if he was dressed too plainly. Jin glanced at his suit, checking with his hand to see if it really fit him well enough for such an important meeting. Pulling away from the phone and finally spotting the guy, Andante greeted him with a smile. The boss cheerfully opened the car door, inviting Jin to sit down, saying that they should go, for Koda had arrived and was waiting for them. The door closed with a click, and they drove to the place. Arriving at the meeting place in a few minutes, Jin had no sooner gotten out of the car than he was immediately stunned, looking in front of him. He saw a huge building that stood out not only for its size, but also for who the people working in it were. It was the headquarters of the Korean National Security Agency, the only S-class guild representing Korea. In addition to being one of the largest organizations, it also had a very good reputation around the world, so even the government was not afraid to come here for help. Andante said casually that this was the place where the meeting would be held. But when he saw the confused look on his mentee's face, he knew it was his first time here. Then the boss asked the guy not to interrupt, and just think of the NSA as a big organization. It was difficult, but Jin said he would follow his boss's advice. As they entered the building, Andante and Jin met a quiet guy with glasses in the center of the hallway. Andante greeted him immediately, calling him Koda and informing him of his arrival. Koda gave him a cold stare. Out of the blue, Jin asks Andante if Cherny is all right. The boss is stumped by the question and wonders why Jin suddenly thought of him. The guy explains that apparently no more than 3 people from each guild are allowed here, and he feels like he's taken Cherny's place. Andante laughs and says he's worrying for nothing, because even if Jin refused, he and Koda would just come here alone, since no eccentric espers are allowed in here, and Cherny is one of those. This news discouraged Jin. He stared at Andante in surprise, saying that Cherny seemed a perfectly adequate person. Then the boss recalls a situation when, about a year ago, he, Cherny, and Koda attended a meeting. That evening, they were approached by a guide whom none of the 3 of them had ever met before, although usually at such events everyone knows each other. Andante continues and says that Cherny had a conversation with the guide, during which Cherny behaved politely and lured the guide outside, posing as a security officer. As they did not know each other, the guide believed him and followed Cherny. And then came the real catastrophe. Suddenly there was a loud explosion that made everyone's ears pop. Those present, lost in speculation, suggested that perhaps someone had gotten into a fight, but the faces of Andante and Koda were the most eloquent. They saw Cherny in the distance, just standing in the middle of all this chaos, with a trace of blood on his suit and smiling uncontrollably as he approached the guests. Thus, Andante says that the meeting turned out to be a total disaster that day. It turned out that the guide already had a support partner who was also his boyfriend, and he was A-class. Apparently, he was jealous of him, and when he saw Cherny hitting on the guide, he immediately jumped on the red-haired guy and tore the place apart. Andante notes that Cherney wasn't exactly sitting still either. Andante concludes his story by saying that since that incident, Cherney has been banned from the NSA headquarters. Also, after that meeting, there was a new unspoken rule that any psycho from the guild was forbidden to show up at meetings under any pretext. Exiting the elevator, Andante still says that no matter what, he'd rather spend another boring day at the office than drag himself here. Jean did inquire as to what condition Cherney was in that day. Although his question surprised his boss, he replied that Cherney had been badly hurt that day, with many bruises and broken arms and legs. The guide turns to Jean and, pointing his finger at his head, says that Cherney should be worried about this part of his body, as it is the part he has the most trouble with, because according to etiquette, it is not customary to approach a guide who has support. Even though Cherney knew this, he still approached the unfamiliar guide. After Andante's story, the boy began to think about the moments when he had met Cherney's eyes. He said that he never thought that Cherney would be capable of such foolishness. And although he had subconsciously sensed something strange, he had never looked suspicious. Suddenly, Jin stops and asks his boss if he helped the red-haired guy that day. But Andante says that he had no reason to stand up for the guy in such a dubious situation. Then Jin asks another question, and asks if Andante had gotten a mountain of condemnation in his direction that day, because as the head of the guild, he should be taking care of his subordinates. The boss didn't like the question, but he just told the guy that Jin is very good-natured. The guy tried to justify himself, but it was too late, as the head of the organization had already started to come on stage and all eyes were staring at him. As he approached the microphones, the man first of all thanked everyone who had appeared at the meeting today. That was Yashin Haichin, the head of the NSA. He said that this time, he would be the one to bring up the rifts. Yashin immediately turns to the main topic of the meeting. He shows a photo and says that this is a picture of the gate that opened 4 days ago. Despite the fact that this has happened before, this time it is a bit different, because this time 11 faults appeared at the same time. Because of this, the government was concerned that everyone would be concentrated on dungeons in only one zone. That's why they gave the order to gather all the guilds at the same time. Yashin continues, and says that since the S-Class dungeon is not a priority at the moment, it has been given to the American Guild. He then leads his conversation to the fact that the remaining rifts in Korea are an NSA problem, and fighting them has been declared a national priority. The head of the NSA then says that he has gathered all the guilds to divide the dungeons among them. After a brief pause, Yashin warns that those who refuse to take part in the dungeon cleanup will be punished, looking coldly at Andante. Jin also realized that there was something wrong, because Yashin was looking at the Noabi Guild when he spoke of punishment. After his words about punishment, Yashin announced that the meeting was over. Sighing defiantly, Andante says that they will have to go to the dungeon after all, complaining that espers are no better than barbarians. Jin finds this behavior rather odd, considering that Andante himself is also an esper. A few moments later, Andante tells Koda to take care of Hesop for now. The guy in glasses, hearing the order from the leader, immediately nodded in response. Meanwhile, Jin himself didn't understand why the words were said. Reading the question in the boy's gaze, Andante told Jin to wait a bit with Koda, and while they waited, the leader insisted that Jin be sure to have a snack, offering him a tray with various appetizers. Alone with Koda, Jin began to feel awkward, and to lighten the mood, he held out a pastry to Koda, suggesting that he eat it too. But Koda turned his head and let Jin know that he wasn't hungry. Hesop didn't insist on his colleague having a snack, and tasted the delicacies offered to the guests. Jin sighed with relief as he ate the cakes, noting that after the meeting, the tension in the air had subsided and everything was calmer, especially since, judging from the behavior of the participants, they didn't care about Hesop. Suddenly, as if by the law of meanness, Jin heard a voice beside him asking him why the guy kept spinning around and looking at the interior. Jin turned his head, seeing a couple of men nearby. They were whispering, pointing fingers at him and Koda, emphasizing that they were the same guys from Noabi. There was laughter, and then some talk about how there had been some crazy guy with them last time. These guys began to openly mock and humiliate Cerny, then turned on the guild as a whole, saying that there was no one capable among them and they were nothing. Jin's gaze changed drastically after saying that. As they continued their conversation, They suggested that since the Noabi had no powers and no help from them, its members should start trading their bodies, at which point the men burst into loud laughter. A few more guys soon joined in on the conversation, bashing the guild and mockingly asking if they were going to skip the dungeon sweep this time around. Then someone added that even if the Noabi wanted to go on a sweep, they couldn't because they were clueless. All this talk didn't inspire any prospects for the guy. On the contrary, he felt depressed as his C-class guild was indeed the worst of the worst by the looks of it. At some point, Jean became unbearable to bear it all. When another joke was made about Noabi members being abandoned even by their parents, the guy approached the two men, saying that they were clearly overreacting. This didn't stop them, on the contrary. They repeated all of this to Jin's face, saying about how everything said was true, and the members of Noabi were indeed abandoned by their parents, and also had no powers. The guy replied that instead of making stupid jokes, they should have wiggled their brains and realized that their jokes could be offensive to people. This answer made the men angry, and one of them shouted at Jean, saying that he was minding his own business, to which the guy replied that he was being polite and common sense, unlike them. Here the man's nerves failed and he reached out to grab Jin's neck. Luckily, Koda appeared at that moment and grabbed his attacker's arm just in time. Koda then sealed the man into the wall with a sharp motion, holding his right arm tightly. Feeling humiliated in front of everyone, the man became nervous and demanded that Koda let go of his hand, indicating that C-class espers shouldn't pounce. But it didn't seem to affect anything. Koda remained adamant and didn't even flinch in the face of the man's threats. Then, when the man tried to free himself from the grip and strike Koda himself, the latter immediately realized the man's intentions and threw him off with force so that the bald guy fell down, throwing everyone into shock. Rising from the ground, the bald esper grinned his teeth and announced that he was about to destroy Koda. Jin was afraid for his comrade and immediately ran up to Koda, asking how he was doing. Koda said he had everything under control. The enemy esper concentrated a blob of energy in his hand, taunting Koda, saying that he was merely showing his courage in front of Jin by bluffing. But then, something happened that made the bald esper's blood run cold. He heard Andante's voice behind him. Out of surprise, the esper, without even making sure who was behind him, threw a punch, catching Andante's face. But then, turning around, the esper was horrified to see that he had hit Andante himself. The Noabi leader smiled, saying that the esper had broken his cheekbone, as proof of which a bruise even appeared on Andante's face. The esper was horrified and denied everything, saying that he couldn't see anything at all and that Andante's face was fine. The leader immediately realized who was in front of him, pointing out that it was a B-class esper from the chess guild. The head of Noabi went on to say that as far as he knew, the leader of this guild was known for his integrity, and he would really dislike such a prank by his ward. To everyone's surprise, the head of the chess guild was here, and from the look of him, he wasn't happy, as Andante had pointed out. He also said that he would let the esper escape quietly, and then he wouldn't say anything to the head. After saying that, the bald esper immediately retreated. Afterward, Jin immediately ran up to the leader, asking him how he felt. Andante smiled and said he hardly felt the blow, although it seemed to Jin that the B-class esper had hit the leader hard. Then the guy asked if it was normal that they let the esper go so quickly, because he had hit Andante. The boss said that he had never met the leader of chess, and that they would never see each other again after that meeting. Jean then asks if this happens often and gets the answer that it does happen quite often at these meetings. The leader says that the C-class is considered the weakest class, so it generates a lot of conflict. He then suggests that maybe it's also because his guild members are very attractive, which is why the others are so jealous of them. Andante also says that since the meeting is over, they can go home. They were about to leave, but then Andante's gaze fell on Koda, and the boss guessed that he wanted to know the results of the meeting. Koda nodded without making a sound. Then Andante smiled and said that he was going to announce the results at the general meeting. But since Koja had done an excellent job of protecting Jin, he would tell the results now. Andante says with a satisfied look that it has been decided that they will go on an A-class dungeon sweep. Jin is very surprised by these words. The guy doesn't understand how a C-class guild can clear a high-level dungeon. Andante tells the guy not to worry, saying that they won't go far anyway. Their task will be to protect the entrance to the dungeon. This explanation wasn't enough for the guy. He says that even this assignment still looks dangerous. and marvels at his supervisor's calmness, assuming he has it all together. Andante says that even if they do go to the dungeon, it won't change anything, and the support format will remain at the previous level, so nothing bad will happen to Jin. But that's not even what bothers Jin, because even a fleeting skin-to-skin contact would be enough to provide support. Toward evening, Koda, Jin, and Andante returned to the guild building. Kearney asked what they were doing there and was told that they were eating a delicious meal. Luckily, Jin had brought his coworker some dessert, so he wasn't so tormented by the fact that he had missed the meeting. Cerny glowed when he heard that someone had taken care of him. He threw his arms around Jin, saying that it was the first time he had ever been treated like that, because no one had ever treated him like that since he had joined the guild. Jin felt awkward, and to support the poor fellow, he stroked his head, noting that at that moment, Cerny looked exactly like a grateful dog. Suddenly, the idol is shattered and someone breaks a wall in the building, throwing Cerny and Jin into a stupor. Immediately after the loud bang, a group of people enter the room, pretending to do just that. Andante shows up, but he is not hostile at all, and asks the new arrivals how they hunted, getting the answer that the hunt was successful this time. A C-class Esper named Fleetus arrives with blue hair in a ponytail. Andante says that he is jealous of the guys, whereupon Flet asks him why the leader didn't go with them. Andante says he's not comfortable talking about it since they've just arrived, but tells Fleta's group that they're planning a dungeon sweep in 4 days. At this time, Fleetus himself sat down in his chair and said that he would be interested to see what was inside, since it had been a long time since they had been in a dungeon. Andante adds that this time they should go down to the A-class dungeon. Flet is surprised to hear his boss say that. The boy asks how Andante managed to get such a high posmal, considering that it's hard for a C-class to get such a high posmal. The leader said that perhaps he should have shut them up and sent them off to clean up the dungeon. Flet laughed and said that Andante must be angry with him now that he had heard the question about the dungeon. Then Flet asks who will be sent to clean up the dungeon, and Andante tells him that he and Flet will go there. This surprises the guy, and he says that the leader must be out of his mind, and that it would be better to take one of the guys. Andante tells the boy to calm down and smilingly says that they are the perfect team, although Fleetus denies it and says that in fact they would make a terrible team. Andante gets Fleetus to say that he can't get away with it because his name is already on the list. This news annoys Fleetus. Andante asks the guy to be ready to leave in 4 days at 7 p.m. Fleetus doesn't like this news either, as the gates open late. However, since it was useless to argue, he jumps up from his chair and says that in that case, it would be good to get support in advance, which makes Jin shudder. Looking at Jin, Flet asks for his support, because in 4 days he has to go on a dungeon sweep. Andante also asks Jin not to refuse, but rather to support all those who have just returned. At this point, Cerny begins to argue with his boss, not understanding why he allows the 4 to receive support, while he is constantly denied it. While Cerny argues with Andante, Jin agrees to support the newly arrived guild members, noting that it appears that his superiors have forbidden Cerny any support. Andante says it's all about Cerny being slightly different from Fleetus and the others, and Fleetus tells the red-haired guy that he's abusing his powers. Cerny howls and says he needs support too. Flet, laughing, tells him that there will come a time when his restrictions will be lifted. Flet holds out his palm to Jin, asking for support. Hessep touches Flet's palm. Then a burst of energy is released and Flet's abilities begin to recharge. At the same time, while supporting Fleetus, Jin quickly began to notice that the guy was rapidly draining him of energy, which made Jin wonder if Fleetus was really a C-class Esper. While supporting Fleetus, Jin notes that he has a lot of poison in his system, wondering how he's feeling. Fleetus says he's fine and feels great, noting that Jin is really in a class of his own. His touch is so refreshing and makes his heart grow cold. Jin asks him to apologize if this has caused Fleetus any inconvenience, but the guy says it's okay. Looking at his hand, Jin involuntarily asks himself whether a C-class needs this level of support. Andante, noticing the boy's strange behavior, asks Jin how he's feeling. Jin says he's fine, but he feels that it's Fleetus who is not feeling well. Andante then remembers that Flet once decided to try bungee jumping, but injured his leg during the jump. Although it healed quickly on the outside, Flet is probably a mess on the inside, to which Flet nods affirmatively. It intrigued Jin. because he hadn't felt it in such detail. He thought it was probably because he had not given support to anyone for a long time. Andante asked if he could give the other arrivals the same support, to which Jin readily agreed. Jin continued to support his coworkers, and he was very good at it, considering that the guy didn't take a break after supporting one Esper. Andante, who was watching from his desk, smiled at Hessup's incredible abilities. Once home, the guy immediately puts on his pajamas and, saying he's tired, falls into bed, noting that even supporting a dying S-Class Esper used to be less of a hassle. And now only 4 S-Class Espers were enough to make the guy feel drained. Jean rolls over onto his stomach, clutching a pillow. He says that the guide's help is needed for the Espers to regain their abilities. This support for the guide is limited per day, but nothing is required of him in return. But when a guide reaches S-Class, he has to pay a price commensurate with his ability. Since there are few of these high-level guides, few people know about it, but if you use your ability, side effects start to appear. And worst of all, there is a sweet odor, which is the most troublesome for the guy. Because of these side effects, the guy was tossing and turning in bed all night, unable to find a place to sleep. Meanwhile, the remaining guild members began to discuss the new guide. Flet says that even though Jin is S-Class, he thought the guy would have some flaws, but it turned out to be different and much cooler. Andante replied with restraint that he was glad that Flet liked their new guide. However, just like Cherney, Flet finds it odd that a high-class guide like Jin would choose to join such a low-level guild as Noabi. Andante asks the guy to elaborate, and Flet says that to him, Jin's motivation to provide support through touch alone doesn't seem enough for him to join a C-class guild. Flet then suggests that maybe Cherney is right and Jean is actually a spy. Andante says that maybe Cherney and Flet are right, and he thought it was strange too, back when he saw Jean's application on his desk. That's why Andante decided to go to Jean's house and see for himself. He pretends to be friendly to get more information out of the guy, but from the conclusions Andante comes to, he says that Jin can't possibly be a spy. The supervisor says it's okay for spies to get into someone else's routine. Flat agrees, and then asks if it could be that Jin is pretending to be suspicious on purpose so that no one will think he is suspicious. Andante smiles and says that one can argue that way indefinitely. The leader asks his colleagues not to worry so much, because Jin Hessup doesn't really look like a spy at all. Flet asks if Andante then thinks that Jin is not hiding anything from them, to which the leader says with a satisfied grin that he doesn't think so. A surprised Flet says that can't be, because Andante himself has just asked them not to worry about anything. The leader rises from his chair with a stack of papers. He says that he only asked them not to worry about Jean being a spy, then tosses the papers on the table in front of Cherney and Fleet. The 2 men ask excitedly what the papers are. Andante tells them to look for themselves, and after a while tells them that according to these records, there is no record of Jean Hessup in Korea, nor is there any record of his tests. Koda says that this is all very strange, to which Flet asks his colleague to explain it all to him in more detail. He also asks Anlante what he wanted to say with all of this. The guide says that he even brought Jin to the meeting, but no one there recognized him. Obviously, if the guide has such a high class, at least someone should recognize him. But according to Andante, no one even in the NSA knows about Jin. This struck Fleetus as most suspicious, since the NSA recruits all guides of such high caliber, and they should know everything about them, including their faces, their name. But the question that plagues him is why, in that case, no one at the meeting recognized Jean. Then Cherney suggests that maybe Jin is just a foreigner, which makes sense and explains a lot. Andante says that it is possible and maybe Jean really is a foreigner, like those who are here. However, even this hypothesis does not explain the fact that the NSA did not know about the arrival of such a guide in Korea, as Cherney says. The Noabi leader says it is possible that Jin entered the country illegally, and therefore there is no record of him. Andante eventually concludes that Jin won't do any harm, so there's not much to worry about. Cherney also says that Jean is fine and tells Fleetus that he's actually cute, which Fleetus doesn't immediately believe. Andante calls those present here lunatics and informs them that it makes no difference what skeletons are hiding in Jean's closet or what he is hiding from them, as his past is no worse than the past of those now left in the room. Andante reminds them that they are ex-criminals, to which Flet asks not to be reminded, after which the boss, as if not minding what he says, emphasizes that they are not just criminals, but criminals. Then the blue-haired guy defiantly tells Andante not to take offense if he gets stabbed in the back, while Cherney smilingly notes that Flet has taken offense. Andante says he won't be sorry as they need Hessup's support right now, especially since he's easy to persuade, gullible and foolish in his own way. Then, Andante finally rips the covers off and, to prove Jean's stupidity, says that while providing support, the guy failed to notice that all of them who are here are all S-class espers, and for them, Jean's appearance is a godsend. Flay says that he thought Jean liked Andante. The guild leader replies that he does, which is why he praised the boy's abilities. Fleet calls Andante a crook, and the guild leader says that no one should show Jin their suspicions and be polite to him so that he doesn't run away. Cherney jumps up from his seat and says he can be polite, to which Andante says with a good-natured smile that it's Cherney he's most worried about. The red-haired guy asks with surprise why, and the leader says that he thinks Cherney won't be able to fulfill Jean's conditions. Cherney, thinking for a second, says that it would be really hard for him. Andante asks Cherney not to overdo it, as it looks like Jin has some kind of injury. The leader warns Cherney that if Jin decides to leave the guild because of him, he will kill Cherney himself, threatening the red-haired boy with the soft smile on his face. Andante lastly asks everyone to be mindful of their new guide, because it's not easy to find a guide who can heal and recharge Esper's abilities with a single touch. The 4 days allotted for preparation are up, and on this day it is time to head out for the dungeon sweep. Andante and the others in their combat gear inform Jin that they are moving to the site. Andante paternally patted Jin on the head, noting that he looked like a sad little puppy, and said it was all right and they could manage on their own. All Jin would have to do was take it easy and wait. The guy is left alone and remembers that usually the guides don't need to go deep into the dungeon and just wait for the espers at the entrance for emergencies. But for some reason, Jin finds it strange that Andante has asked him to stay home at all. A coworker comes up to the guy and tries to calm him down, telling him that he really shouldn't worry, asking if Jin knows anything about the debuff ability. That is the ability to weaken a target. The guy nods, signaling that he's heard of it. Then Jin is informed that Andante is able to build artificial skies anywhere, and thus cause different weather phenomena. Normally, the Koleka says, espers only control one type of phenomenon, but Andante has no such limitations. Jin still finds it strange, because there is no sky in the dungeons, so he doesn't understand where rain or thunderstorms come from. But Cherney continues the story and says that every natural phenomenon has its own debuff, and this is the coolest one. Jin was very interested in hearing Cherney's story about Andante's abilities, but the boy reasonably asked why, if Andante was really so strong, his class was only C. Cherney said that it was because Andante had only one ability and could not use it anymore. He leads his story to the fact that Andante can't fight alone, so his class isn't as high. However, his ability allows the leader to work with almost anyone, but remembering Fleet, Cherney adds that the ability allows Andante to work with almost anyone. Jin then asks about Fleetus's abilities, assuming he's good at close combat. Cherney praises the guy for his smarts and says that because of his strength and agility, Fleetus favors one-on-one combat, while Andante can create a debuff by staying at range and preferring ranged combat. However, Cherney says that their guild members prefer to fight alone, so trying to help each other will likely only reduce the effectiveness of their abilities. Jin then asks him why Flet was sent to the cleanup in the first place. Cherney says he doesn't know what's going on in Andante's head, but assumes that the boss is just trying to mess with Fleet. Then the guy just says that Jean shouldn't worry about it, and Jean says that he shouldn't worry about it and everything will be fine, considering that the boss himself assured the guy that they wouldn't go into the dungeon. It had been a long time since the team had gone to clean up the dungeon and evening had fallen. Jin was still waiting for his colleagues in the guild building, and to pass the time he decided to read a book. Meanwhile, time continued to tick inexorably, and evening began to change into night. Jin, reading the book, began to feel tired, and then he closed his eyes for a second. Waking up, the guy realizes with horror that a lot of time has passed and deep night has fallen on the street, and Andante and the others have not yet returned. When he gets up from the couch, he decides to turn on the light because the room is already very dark. As he searches for the light switch, Jean sees a strip of light in front of him, and behind it stands what he thinks is Andante. Jin calls his name in a quiet voice. The supervisor asks why the boy didn't go home today, and Jin tells him that he stayed here and waited for everyone to return from their assignments. Andante apologizes and says that he should have made it clear that Jin could go home after hours. Hesop said he was fine and managed to get some sleep. He was glad to hear his boss's voice, though he couldn't see his face properly. But he noted that Andante's voice sounded quite normal. The guy was confused by the fact that Andante was alone and asked the boss where Flet had gone, to which he was told that Flet was unconscious. The supervisor tells the guy to wait a bit while he turns on the lights because it's hard to see inside. He fumbles for the switch and flicks it, flooding the room with light. But at the same time, getting a good look at Andante Jin's face made him feel sick and horrified. Andante's face expressed nothing but surprise, but his cheek and suit were stained with blood. Jin jumped up from his seat and said he'd back the man up right away, but the head refused with a smile, saying he was fine. However, he said that since Hesop was here, it would be a good idea to lend support to Fletus, who had been lying motionless on the ground all this time. Without a second's hesitation, Jin rushed to Fletus, asking him how he was feeling, but he didn't hear any answer. Andante thought Jin was scared, so he told the boy that he wanted him to see them tomorrow, when they would be back to normal, and he didn't want to scare the boy. Jean said that wasn't the point, and he was concerned about Fletus's condition, to which Andante said the guy wouldn't die if he got support a day later. But Jin, in spite of these words, said he would start the support immediately, taking Fletus by the hand and beginning the process. Andante told him not to, but it was too late. As soon as Fleet's weakened body began to receive support from the guy immediately opened his eyes and instantly jumped up from his seat, piling on top of the uncomprehending Jin. With his teeth, Flet bit off the collar and buttons of Jean's shirt, exposing the boy's neck, to which he immediately set his teeth, intending to bite Jean. Holding Jean's hands to stop him from struggling, Fletus managed to bite him, and then to pull the dumb Jean to the floor, hovering over him. The boy looked genuinely terrified, and he wheezed with all his might for Fletus to stop. Jin looked directly into Flet's eyes, but he saw no remnants of humanity in them, but instead a beastly desire to be satiated. He closed his eyes and prepared to be devoured by Fletus, but Andante stopped Fletus just in time by thrusting his blade into his back. Flet then regained consciousness, scolding Andante for sticking a knife in the dying Esper's back. The guild leader confirmed that Flet had finally regained consciousness, emphasizing that he was beginning to think that the guy wouldn't regain consciousness on his own. Jin was lying on the floor, unable to move. He was scared and didn't know what to do. Flet looked at Andante and said that he wasn't going to go all the way, saying that Andante knew that very well. Andante says he wasn't sure about that at all. The leader then walks over to Jin and holds out his hand, asking him how he's feeling. He then says that if the guy is scared, he can hold Andante's sleeve instead of his hand. But Jean says that he's fine and he doesn't mind. Fleet scratches the back of his head in embarrassment and, realizing his action, avoids Jean's gaze, but nevertheless asks the guy to try again. The blue-haired guy holds out his hand to Jean, and the latter, noting that he's still scared to try something like that a second time, nevertheless stretches his hand toward him. This time it goes better, and the right recovery reaction occurs. Jin notes that the guy's hand is colder this time than the last, and his strength alone is not enough. Snuggling close to Jean, Flat asks with interest how far he can go in providing support. He recalls that Jean wanted to keep physical contact to a minimum, but never said where that boundary was. Jean has always thought that kissing is okay when providing support, but the guy thinks it's better to do without it this time. While Jin hesitates, Flet gets on top of the guy and starts sliding his hands under his shirt, demanding that Jin make a decision faster because he can barely contain himself. Then he whispers in the guy's ear that even though they can't go all the way to the end, there is something they can do. Jean's breathing is getting heavier, Fletus's touch is making his thoughts confused, and he can't articulate his thoughts clearly. The boy probably takes advantage of this state of affairs, continuing to grope his guide. Fletus once again asks the boy if he is sure that close physical contact is not required, because Jin's body says otherwise. Suddenly, Andante calls out to Flet, demanding that he stop, and he stares at Andante with an incredulous look on his face. The supervisor looks at Fletus like he's a naughty dog, and he apologizes, saying he didn't mean to overreact. Andante sits down next to Jean and asks Flet to leave the room. As they head into the other room and Fleetus sits down on the couch, Jin approaches the guy. Jean tells Fleetus that his boundary, which Fleetus asked about earlier, is kissing. But Fleetus isn't interested, saying he doesn't need to and that just holding hands will be enough, given that Jean doesn't look good at all. The boy did not resist and agreed to be touched by Fletta's hands. He sat down beside him on the chair and began to energize him through his touch, under Andante's watchful eye. It had been quite some time, and Flet said he had enough support for the day. Standing up from his chair, he asked Andante if he could rest a bit, and the leader said he didn't see a problem. Then Flet left the room, thanking the guy for his support. Looking at Fleetus leaving, Jean had mixed feelings. He realized that the guy was not fully recovered yet, and saw his own fault in it, as his range of services was not wide enough to fully restore Fleetus's condition. Then, when he and his supervisor were alone in the room, Andante asked the boy to get ready and said he would take him home. Jean bowed politely and said thanks for not having to walk home in the street like that, or he might have been taken to the police station for his torn shirt. At this time, Andante himself decided to change his clothes a little, as they were already stained with blood. He took off his shirt, and Jin was horrified to see a huge scar on the leader's chest. The boy was horrified, for compared to humans, Esper's wounds healed faster, but he could only guess where Andante had gotten such a large scar. He also decided that even such a big scar could go away if support was given in a short time. Then the boy told Andante that he wanted to give him support. The leader looked at him almost indifferently and said that he would be all right, and it was Jin who needed to get some rest, for Flet had apparently sucked a lot of strength out of Jin. The guy tried to tell the leader that he was fine and able to help him, but Andante interrupted him and said that if Jin still had strength, he should spend it on the rest of the guild tomorrow, then told Jin to get in the car. Looking at the way Andante looks after his visit to the dungeon and the way he drives his car around the city at night, Jin notes that at times like this, the boss seems unapproachable, but he still wonders why Andante doesn't accept his support. Jin thinks that he could at least be a little supportive of Andante before he goes home. Jean gets the idea that if this continues, Andante might lose control. When the car pulled up outside Jin's house and the supervisor, smiling, said that Jin might not come tomorrow because he must be very tired, the boy said he still wanted to give him support, holding out his hand to Andante. But Andante didn't let him do that, and intercepted Jin's hand himself, holding it by the sleeve of his shirt. Andante reprimanded Jin for such behavior, while the boy surprisingly kept asking the leader why he was so stubbornly refusing support. Andante reminds Jin that he's already told him several times that he's fine. Then Hesop asked the leader if he was in pain. Looking at the guy with his assertive eyes, Andante warned the guy that he shouldn't do that and asked Jin not to cross the line. Andante asks Jean not to do anything else he isn't asked to do. Jean apologizes, but the supervisor tells him it's unnecessary and still thanks the guy for waiting for them at the office. Jin gets out of the car and tells Andante to be careful, and then he looks sharply at his hand and sees Andante's fingerprints on it, realizing how strong he really is. Jin says that when Andante grabbed his hand, he couldn't give support because the leader refused, but he couldn't help but feel his strength. Plus, he recalls Andante's glowing eyes. Jin says that such eyes appear to an Esper when he's on the verge of a breakdown. Given all this, Jin concludes that Andante's poison is far more than could be accumulated overnight. 5 days later, it was a beautiful day and everyone was gathered in the guild building as usual, waiting for something interesting to happen. Then, when Andante enters the room, everyone is alive. The leader asks the mentees if they want to go on a trip. It was a surprise to everyone, but Andante says he thought it would be nice to go on a trip in honor of Jin. Cherney, as usual, was the most expressive of all and immediately began to persuade Jean to go with them. Jean said that if everyone agreed, he would go with them, of course. Andante cheered up when they were unanimously in favor of the idea and suggested that the others move out right away. Jin was surprised at the sudden journey and said that it would be a good idea to pack and take everything with him first. But Andante says that everything is ready for the journey and that only Hesop is missing. Jin says that's how their unexpected journey began. Someone in the guild said that portals are a very good thing because they were in Gyeongnam in just a few moments. In front of the company was a gorgeous view of the sea and an equally cool beach with cafes and palm trees. After that, Andante took his charges to the apartment to show them the conditions in which they would live during the trip. Jin was amazed at how beautiful the interior of the apartment was, but Cherney and Flat were not so happy. They said that they had been seeing the sea quite often lately, and they had long since gotten tired of it. Jin asked the others how they liked the view, and they all agreed that they didn't like the sea. Koda said that it was because the guild office used to be on the shore. Then Cherney asks the boy what he thinks of the sea, and Jean says that he likes the sea because he has lived among the mountains. Then Cherney says that the sea is not so good because it's wet, noisy, and machinery breaks down all the time. He also says that annoying elements often appear here, whereupon Jean begins to think that Cherney means something like jellyfish and other sea creatures. Suddenly, Cherney tells Jean that there is a spa downstairs and suggests that he go there together. He says there's probably no one there since it's closed to VIP guests, and Cherney says it would be nice to lie in the hot water. Jean refuses, and Cherney asks if it's because he doesn't like him, but Jean says it's not that, and Fleetus intervenes and says that if he were a tour guide, he wouldn't go to the spa with Cherney either.